So up front, the first thing about me to understand, and she cut it out of my introduction, I'm very disappointed, is that I am a pitcher bats supremacist in baseball. I do not agree with the American League rule. I think it's dumb that the National League went that way. And it's very important that you understand that about me, because that sort of idiotic contrarianism explains everything about me. I'm not in any way, shape, form, or fashion someone that would have arrived at Bitcoin by any sort of typical means. And what I mean by that is, I worked in logistics my entire career. I grew up a big city kid, but also spending a lot of time on the farm. And so for me, everything I've ever dealt with is the real, right? It's if I can't put my hands in it, if I can't kill it and eat it, if I can't go to a store and pick it up, it's all notional to me. And so the thing about supply chains is that to the extent it's influenced by monetary policy, it's influenced by political decision making, there is some of that, but to me, nothing is real until something moves. I don't really care about monetary policy up to the extent that a thing has not been manufactured, thus it cannot be shipped, thus someone cannot buy it. And if they can't do that, then it has always not been that interesting to me. So I've always been very concerned with the way things are made, the way things are shipped, the way humans meet their needs. But monetary policy to me was always sort of like this kind of vague thing. Bitcoin is interesting to me. Maybe for the first time I've really cared about anything economically, not because of Bitcoin itself. I know a lot of people come to Bitcoin as it's a financial instrument, or it's a hedge against inflation, or a lot of these other things that you hear. What I'm interested in is in the kind of people that are associated with Bitcoin. By and large, it is people that came to it because of individual sovereignty, or because they just don't trust that the powers that be that are making economic policy have the best interest at heart of the people. And if I'm anything, first and foremost, it is an enormous believer in the American Constitution, not as we practice it today, but as it was originally intended, which was a document that was first and foremost about making people free to live their lives to the extent they can, to cooperate with one another, and to have a representative political system that does that for them. That is something I believe very strongly in, and I think over the last 200, however odd years, since the founding of that document, all we've done every year, with every decision, is drift further and further from that original intent. And now we've arrived at a point in history where we don't make things for ourselves anymore, except our food. The food we make is not necessarily good for us. Joel's not in here at the Untapped Growth, but he would agree with me, right? We don't do things for ourselves that we used to do because we began to compromise everything about how we make and ship and fulfill our needs as consumers and as Americans against financial considerations and against financial policy that does not put the individual first. So my journey to Bitcoin is very much almost a bit of an awakening. And so to the extent that I care about what Bitcoin does, I don't care if it's $40,000 today or $50,000 or whatever it may be. I care about what it is as a vehicle, as an instrument for individual people to be able to see where we are at with these very fragile supply chains that we have. People connecting for the first time, there's 70 ships floating or at anchor off the coast with 60 in berth, and nobody cared about that before. In June of last year, we had 6 ships off the coast of California, and they weren't doing overflights. That had never happened before, right, except in the strikes. But nobody cared then, but people care now. The average person does care and is following about why there's shortages, why things are made overseas, why we have done the things we have done that are increasingly fragile and making us as consumers and as Americans a little bit more scared for the future than we've been in a long time. And so I had a good question just before. It was, the question was, well, are you going to talk about how Bitcoin makes supply chains easier, or like how we can build supply chains around Bitcoin? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes. But because I am a hard-headed pragmatist, because I still believe in real things, right? There are some very real barriers and hurdles that we have to figure out, both individually and at a collective scale. My money is where my mouth is on this topic. I'll explain that. But we have to be able to get to a point where the real, tangible ways in which countries, in which regions within a country, in which companies and individuals conduct commerce by, with, and through each other, we have to find those gaps and say, this is a deal breaker. If we cannot find a way through the blockchain technology or through Bitcoin or some combination of the two. I'm just intelligent enough to know that there is a difference. But we have to find those ways that technology can be leveraged in intelligent ways and brought down to a workable level before we can say, well, Bitcoin's going to fix everything. It's not going to fix everything. There is an entire system that has been built up over hundreds of years that is dedicated explicitly to destroying and degrading the ability of individuals to build their own supply chains, to harden their own supply chains in their lives. Bitcoin, for the first time, is a moment we have the ability to do that. And so, like I said, I'm not an evangelist for Bitcoin, I'm not an evangelist for blockchain, I'm an evangelist for anything that makes it easier for people to eat, to put gas in their car, to turn their taps on, and to live a little bit more without fear and a little bit less with government interference. One of the things that's interesting to me is the extent to which people really care, and it was blowing my mind. You know, Mitch Morse did his 101 session, and then Adam just did his session where he was talking about, you know, using flare-off to power Bitcoin rigs. And those are technological innovations. They're mechanical innovations to solve a need. And so my background is actually in a mix of logistics, but also military strategy. I do a lot of geopolitical work, consulting to the government, consulting to various branches of the military. And one of the individuals that has changed the game the most in both domains is John Boyd. And a lot of people in the last year have kind of become familiar with like the term OODA loop, which is just a decision-making framework of observe, orient, decide, and act. But it's a very, very deep, iterative process of human thought. And so Boyd became very famous for that, but he did a lot of other things as well in his time. John Boyd's the reason that the FX program happened, which gave us the F-15, the F-16, and the F-18 jets that our military flies today. One man was able to build an entire ecosystem of supply chains around one idea and one concept, which is energy maneuverability theory. So when that guy says a thing, and he's passed away, he died in 1994, but when that guy says a thing, I'm listening. When someone said, this is what John Boyd used to say, I'm listening. And what he always said to people, what he always reminded people, this guy who lived in the clouds with these unbelievable ideas, was people, ideas, and technology in that order. And what he meant by that was in the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower warned us about, but also in corporate life, and in Bitcoin, and in anything else. The impetus is for people to try to find a technological solution or an innovation that does not work with human nature, but that works against or around human nature. And that's a difficult thing to do in supply chain world and logistics world, because the world of maritime commerce is not something we've dreamt up in the last 20 years. We still do business today in the ocean industry the same way we did business in the age of sail. There are things that we do in our industry that are governed by practices that were, innovated by the Dutch VOC or the British East India Company back in the 15 and 1600s. Bitcoin and blockchain are not going to change things that have been around for 500 or 600 years unless we understand what those things are and how to work through them and how to work around them by leveraging human nature, and by leveraging natural human systems, and by putting people first. So good ideas and good innovation and technology necessarily should follow from good people working together to meet each other's needs. Not by saying this is going to be some magical thinking or some panacea that's going to solve everything or fix everything. It's not. But there are ways to make it happen. There are ways to make that real. So coming out of the pandemic, we've got what I've identified as two major trends. The first, and I think is one that's very familiar to anybody who's kind of following the news, is that China has decided it's no longer a friend of the United States. Right? That's becoming increasingly apparent to people. The problem was China decided that 25 years ago. And we're just now waking up to this reality. So that country has been building and building and building a technological advantage, an advantage in the number of ships that it's deployed on water, an advantage in its missile envelope, an advantage in its cyber capabilities, while the United States slept. While we amused ourselves in two terrible wars that cost us an awful lot of lives and an awful lot of treasure. I supported the wars when they started because I thought maybe we were doing the right thing. It became pretty clear at some point we weren't. And maybe we were just there because we didn't know what to do, right? But while we were doing that, everybody else was racing ahead of us. So the reality of the world today was set 25 years ago. In 1999, 2 Chinese colonels published a paper. Some people have heard of it. It's called Unrestricted Warfare. And the whole premise of the paper was, if you could take down the United States as an inferior power, how would you do it? And it turns out they followed the playbook to the hill. Those 2 guys are now 2 senior generals in the PLA. They're very powerful members of the Chinese Communist Party, and they are in charge of military-civil fusion, which is how China weaponizes supply chains and weaponizes the commercial sector to mirror the needs of the defense and industrial base of China as a means of enhancing it. In the United States, we have the tail that wags the dog. We have Raytheon, we have Lockheed, we have all these guys that have built up their supply chains around meeting the needs of the United States to go make war somewhere. So it's the inverse. Here the military serves the policy of the commercial sector. In China, it's the opposite. Those 2 strategies, those 2 worldviews have now come to a bit of a loggerheads. China has decided that the supply chains are now a weapon, and that they're going to do everything they can to utilize that against the West. That bifurcation, a lot of people are like, well, it's Cold War 2.0. It's not Cold War 2.0. Right? The United States was never dependent on the Soviet Union for anything. We were the economic engine of the world. We had the dollar as the global reserve currency. Most of the freedom-loving world followed what the United States did. We made it, they bought it. Eventually, globalization built up around that. Okay, we can go make it somewhere else, and we'll buy it here. Europe followed suit as their economic recovery out of World War II happened. Soviet Union did what it did inside its own sphere of influence, but there was very little interconnectivity. It was mainly a conflict of ideological and political and economic systems. It was certainly not a synthesis of the 2, as we've seen here in the United States. So we are again coming into a bipolar world, whether we like it or not. We did not get to make that decision as America, but it was made for us, and so here we are. And the world is going to line up in rank and file behind the United States and the things that we are able to make and able to ship and able to influence. And other parts of the world, mainly in Eurasia, are going to be lining up behind China in the same way. Because they're either co-opted or coerced, or simply because they feel there's more money to be made by picking that stronger horse in their worldview. That trend is going to give rise to an interesting trend on a micro level, which is going to be as the West is able for a time to make fewer and fewer and fewer things for itself, because we have outsourced everything to the part of the world that's going to fall in behind China. The tension is now going to become what happens at that small level, the individual supply chain level. My home, parts for my car, things that affect me in a very real way when I'm sitting at the kitchen table and I'm trying to figure out what to do next. Apart from my refrigerator broke, right? Whatever it may be, that tension between a globalized supply chain system and me at my individual level trying to figure out how to meet my needs and trying to help my neighbors figure out their needs, that's going to come into tension greater than ever before. The average American is more aware now than they've ever been of where things come from and why shortages are happening, but we're still in a moment where we don't know what to do about it. I'm talking about larger, to some extent geopolitical, certainly geoeconomic trends. And I'm not going to make a political statement. Anybody who follows me on Twitter's got a pretty good idea of my political leanings anyway, right? I'm pretty open about it. But when I say this, understand it's not coming from a left-right dichotomy or red-blue or whatever it may be. This is coming from to the extent I have any expertise, the calculus of are we equipped at a leadership level, both from a Federal Reserve side, from a political side in the White House, from the various agencies that fall up under the executive and congressional branches, even the ability of the Supreme Court justices to begin to filter these things out as they start to figure out what's going on with vaccine mandates. How much do we push people before we push them too far? To serve a political end or to serve a public health end, to the extent maybe one of us recognizes it differently than the other. So all of that leadership that's in place at the federal level, at the judicial level, and at the state level in a lot of cases, they are wholly and completely unequipped and inadequate to the task of the moment before them. And that means pain. The good news is that there are some ways in which not just people like me, but thousands of people like me that work at all levels of the logistics and in the supply chain world work at Walmart, we work for trucking companies in my own job. I'm director of global logistics for a food and feed ingredient company. We move hundreds of millions of dollars of stuff around the world, but mainly inside the US, that goes towards making food healthier and cheaper. And some things that makes it way unhealthy, but those are the compromises we have to make with an industrial food system. Sorry, Joel. But there are thousands of us working at all levels trying to solve these problems, knowing that these things are coming, knowing that if I'm dependent on making an amino acid in China that goes into hog and swine, or goes into swine and poultry production to make them healthier, to fatten them up a little faster, to give them more protein content per pound. If that's made in China, that's the only place in the world, I personally have two choices. I gotta find a way to make it here, or I have to work with the producers who are feeding these animals out to say, you know what, we're stuck monkey, man, we can't get it out of China, so we gotta come up with an alternative. Another product, another blend, something that doesn't disrupt the food supply chain. And we are trying to figure that out. The good news is that those of us that are sort of on the front lines, we've been on the front lines of this from the very beginning, so we've been iterating these solutions since last year, since the year before. In my case, I started in 2006 in the industry, and I've been working on that since then. I saw back in 2006 how damaging ethanol was to the corn supply chain. When beef producers were suddenly looking at $3 corn when their budgets a month before were for $2 corn per bushel. So now they can't blend corn at the ratio that they need to get the protein and the fat content inside the cows or inside the pigs, so they got to go to something else. So I've been watching those compromises having to be made where public policy and financial policy drives bad supply chain policy. Makes things more expensive, makes us more dependent on other countries or on companies that have a financial or profit motive or power motive ahead of what's best for an individual. So to bring it back to where I was at the top of this, my interest in Bitcoin and blockchain as a financial instrument is notional at best. I don't trade. I don't own Bitcoin. I don't own Ethereum or any of the others, so don't jump me on that. But I am extremely interested in how any economic system, particularly those that meet humans at their point of need, can be taken away from the bad political and the bad profit motive decisions that are being made by these companies that drive our world, and rip that away from them and put a little bit more control back in people's hands. So I had to set that table with a lot of that introduction to say that the path forward is not going to be to completely decouple from the system. You can't do that immediately. All of the infrastructure is dominated by the dollar. All of the trucks are leased and the drivers paid for in dollars. All of the natural gas plants that we need for energy or to make fertilizers, all of that's paid for in dollars. Or in other parts of the world, whatever the host nation's currency is, probably also in dollars. So we have to recognize that there are some trade realities in the world that have built up around the Westphalian way of doing things. Is anybody familiar with the Treaty of Westphalia? Of course you are. So the Westphalian era began when England and France resolved some of their disputes after one of their 15 wars that they fought over a 300-year period. But that began the Westphalian era, which was the era of dominance of nations, not just from a military side, but also from what we would recognize as a proto-supply chain side. The VOC, the British East India Company, built up out of that time period. They served the interests of the crowns, but their job was to utilize a combined commercial and military presence, what we may recognize as a bit of a gray zone capability, to go into other places in the world and to find cheaper ingredients or high demand luxury goods and bring them back to the empires. And so the era of nation state dominance and supply chains and corporations began on the backs of their ability to trade things and move things at a scale nobody had been ever able to before. Out of that built Admiralty law. Out of Admiralty law came things like the cannon shot rule, right? Which originally was 7 nautical miles off the shores. That's your sovereign waters. Within that, you can do whatever you want. You can enforce it legally. You can exploit it as much as you want to. But then there's this globalization sort of began, the United States began to discover oil 12 miles offshore at the edge of our continental shelf. Well, Mexico, Canada, whomever could come in and exploit that originally and say, hey, we want that oil. And so Truman and some of the others at the time said, well, we're not going to allow this. That's our oil. Those are our fisheries, right? And so then the regulatory piece of supply chain conflict came in. The United Nations began to be weaponized in international law. So we had to have more ways of doing business. We had to create more complicated bills of lading and contracts of carriage. We had to create more complicated financial instruments to do all of these things. And at the same time we're doing that, the United States is in a 50-year Cold War with the Soviet Union, and we began exploiting the United Nations and its regulatory apparatus as a way to hedge and box them in. So we just began layering, decade after decade, century after century, what once was just England's way or France's way or the Netherlands way of saying, hey, there's a thing there, we want that, and we're going to bring it here, became this vastly convoluted web of finance, and law, and politics, all interacting with each other in a way that was ultimately more restrictive for the individuals underneath the crown of the government that was supposed to be speaking for them. And there's one thing that we can know, it's simply that incentives matter. Incentives matter. And when we began to create derivatives off of all of this activity in the markets, when we began to find new ways to make profit or to gain control over sectors of these, of supply chains, those incentives matter, and that which can be gained will certainly be gained. For whatever motive may be, money, ideology, coercion, or ego, the mice factors are the four main reasons anybody does anything. They do it because they want to make money. They do it because they believe in it. They do it because they were forced into it or coerced into it or blackmailed into it. Or they do it simply because it gives them a thrill. Mainly with the things we're concerned with, here, and I can't say we, like I'm part of Bitcoin space, I'm certainly not, but as an outside observer who's extremely interested in how to take the best of what's happening here and turn it into a tool for good, turn it into a force for good at the individual level, to create a parallel economy, a parallel infrastructure that allows people to ultimately break away, there's still this transition phase. And that transition phase, in my view, is the mechanism of supply chains, because that's where humans meet their point of need. And if you can meet them at that point of need, that's where they're willing to start to change things politically, financially, and overhaul the way they were willing to do things before. You don't have to leverage fear. You don't have to leverage uncertainty or doubt. You don't have to promise that there's all the money in the world on the other side of it. All you have to do is say, this is a mechanism and a tool that will very easily get you from here to there, to get you to that better place. In that regard, I'm as much of an evangelical for Bitcoin as anybody, because I think it is the only tool and the only thing we have right now available to us that can get people to change their behaviors. We don't need to change their voting patterns. You don't need to change the politicians they donate to. You don't need to change the food they eat. You don't need to do any of that. You just have to make it easier for this thing that we're here to talk about, have been all day, to get from the old way and the old order and its 500 years way of doing things to a new way of doing things. To make it easier for someone to call Joel up and say, hey man, I want to buy a 12-ounce steak, or I want to buy a whole side of beef. I want to feed that out. Okay, but to the extent that Joel can take that order in Bitcoin and transact that business in Bitcoin, he still has to deal with the USDA. He still has to deal with the fact that they're, custom slaughtering and custom processing is not a thing that's available to him at the scale it should be. So you have a political and a regulatory bottleneck that Bitcoin cannot break through. But people can. Laws can be changed. Regulatory things can be adjusted. But it does take enough people saying, you know what, I can do everything up to this 90% solution, and up to that I can only modify my behavior and the behavior of others so far, and then we have to go change things. So is Bitcoin going to change things, and overnight we're all going to wake up and be able to go to Walmart and buy things? No. No. But what we can do is a few of these examples of things that I've come up with where I think if we can do this, and begin small, and you begin to nibble at the margins, what the Chinese call salami slicing, which is how they go in and they just take off little parts of other people's countries, like they've done in India, Bhutan, Pakistan, Tajikistan. All of a sudden, they've expanded their borders by hundreds of miles and taken control of resources, and the world woke up and said, oh God, they've already built military bases and all that, we can't stop them. A salami slicing strategy works though. It works as a means of insurrection, positive insurrection, be very clear about that, but as a means of people saying, okay, we're going to change things from the inside. You don't need violence, you don't need anger and animosity, you don't need to go on CNN and call the other side a bunch of assholes. What you need to do though is adjust your own behavior and then help people, make it easier for people to do the same. Irish democracy is the way, right? You guys familiar with that term? You got a vague idea? So, Irish democracy is the term that the English came up with when every time the king would hand down a royal edict, hey, guess what, Irish farmers? I need another 5% of your crop this year. It's been expensive going and fighting the Germans. Maybe the Irish would comply. Maybe they wouldn't. Most often they didn't comply. They'd show up and they'd say, well, here it is. And the royal tax collectors would say, no, you produced this amount last year, we need 5% more. Sorry, yield wasn't there. That wheat's not there, the potatoes aren't there, whatever it may be. It was the Irish's way of pushing back without causing an entire revolution that they knew they would lose. They just didn't comply. They didn't make a thing of it. They didn't do billboards. They didn't go throw Molotov cocktails. Got all the king's soldiers in their funny red uniforms. They just didn't do it. They just chose to do something different. And in the process of repeatedly and consistently choosing to do something just a little bit different, but not up to the threshold of engaging conflict or engaging the censors and the authorities, they just chose to opt out. They demanded to be able to do it this way. So if I want to change the way, if I want to go to Kroger and buy everything in Bitcoin, I don't change that by going and demanding that Kroger take Bitcoin, by starting a revolution around that. They're not equipped to do that. They're not equipped to make that technological and mental transformation that would make that feasible. But what you can do is nibble at the margins of that until one day the executives in the supply chain, procurement, and sales functions at Kroger wake up and they realize that half of their vendors are taking payments in Bitcoin and thus can offer services to Kroger in Bitcoin. Half of the people, the truck drivers that are delivering goods into the distribution centers are getting paid in Bitcoin, or at least have the option to. And suddenly what is no longer an impossibility is just another option. You don't turn it on and off all at once. You just have to make the option there. So this is how you do it. I'm glad Joel's in the room, actually. I've shouted him out a couple times. But what he's doing at the farm level is a great example of how it gets done, of how Bitcoin and blockchain are used. Historically, it has been an issue in the local food economy or localism, which, by the way, I'm a huge advocate for localism. I buy as much as I can from my local butcher. I'm in a food co-op, do the whole thing. But food is a very, very important lever, and it's a very easy way to convince people to change behaviors, to change the way they buy and sell. So if I want to go to him and say, hey, I want to buy 3 cows and feed them out over the next year or 2 years or whatever it may be. I want to have you process them, package them, and I'll come pick them up, or I want to have you arrange to deliver them to me. It starts with him just being willing to transact that business in Bitcoin and me being willing to buy it from, or sell, buy it from him in the same currency. Or it's him having the ability to transact business. I can pay him in dollars and he can clear that sale in Bitcoin. Or I can pay him in Bitcoin and he can clear it in dollars. Because if he's got to go buy farm equipment, they're probably not taking Bitcoin. They're still taking dollars, right? Or some vague notion of dollars that's digitally transacted, right? So he has to have the optionality as the buyer and seller, and I have to have the optionality as the buyer and seller, not only to do that deal, but also to be able to use that deal and influence the second order vendor networks around it. It works a bit like a virus. Okay? Everybody doesn't get sick at once. Everybody gets sick at different timelines and at different paces. But if every single person just says, within my little bitty ability to influence the world around me, we create the optionality to do that business in Bitcoin, that's where it begins, is on the buyer and seller side. Because that's where human behavior begins to change the fastest. What that rolls up to is people like me who exist at the second or third order level from that local transaction between one buyer and one seller. And that's where things get a little bit hazy and it gets a little bit murky. If someone has to buy a feed ingredient from overseas, an entire ecosystem of stakeholders steps in to make that transaction real. You have the manufacturer. In my industry, there's probably a broker who's doing business with the manufacturer, and I'm actually buying from the broker, and they're handling certain things like arranging the loading of containers or ships or whatever it may be. I have my own team in China and India and wherever that's actually arranging for the loading of things and making sure it actually gets onto the ship. There's freight forwarders, there's customs brokers, there's truckers, there's longshoremen, there's this whole gamut of people in between that are touching the product and transacting the business on my behalf and on the shipper's behalf. It's not just buyer and seller. All right? At the local level, it's me and Joel. At the international level, it's me and 20 people in between working variously for different governments, companies, entities, themselves. And all of us have to find a way to resolve our needs in a common currency and under a common framework. So that's where commercial documents come in. Has anybody ever done international trade? You know what I mean when I say commercial documents? Good. That's why my hair fell out a long time ago. Don't do it. Commercial documents, when any international transaction happens, three things are generated. A bill of lading is generated. A bill of lading is a document that simply spells out the parameters of the ship. Who's buying, who's selling, who the customs broker is, what's being bought, what's being sold, what the value of it is. It also deals with the transportation mode and things like that. When a bill of lading is issued by an ocean carrier, it is not just spelling out the parameters of the shipment, it is also a contract of carriage. Which is where you've heard Maersk and IBM and some of the others get into this whole concept of smart contracts for freight. That's all it is. It's a digital, it's an e-bill of lading. The reason bill of ladings matter is because it is the first time in a transaction that a legal framework recognized under international law has been introduced to the equation. Not the purchase order, not the sales order, none of that is considered legally binding. A shipper or a buyer can wipe their ass with it, and often do. In certain countries in particular, it is very hard to conduct trade on an open and honest basis. The bill of lading is generated, a commercial invoice is generated. That's the second piece of the commercial documents. The commercial invoice is the twin to the bill of lading. The bill of lading is a contract of carriage. The commercial invoice is the internationally recognized terms of sale and ownership of that product. On that is something called an Incoterm, or an international commercial term. There are, I think at last count, 13 Incoterms. Those Incoterms are 3 letters, and they all mean something different. And what they spell out is the rights of the buyer and seller, the risk of loss in the event the cargo is damaged or lost in transit, and where that happens, and who's responsible for payment of all of the various things in between. The freight, paying, the terminal handling charges at the origin port, who pays the trucking, who pays customs and duties and tariffs. All of that is determined by the Incoterm. The bill of lading, you have the commercial invoice, which matches the bill of lading. You have a packing list. For certain things that are very, very high value, we use a 500-year-old piece of financial technology called a letter of credit. Letter of credit's a term that's probably a little more familiar to people. You probably heard about it in like a high school finance class. Here's where it gets interesting, and here's where Bitcoin really begins to matter and begins in an international trade way to reshape supply chains. Letters of credit are essentially one bank, like a check, one bank promising to pay another bank on behalf of everybody involved. Okay? So the issuing bank who issues the letter of credit writes out a very long series of terms and agreements. Usually it's about 20 to 25 things that If the business is transacted according exactly to these parameters, they will guarantee that $10 million payment to another bank overseas, who and then will in turn disperse those funds. Very simple. Most of us know how that works. It is mainly like a check, except for this. If any part of the transaction, if any part of the commercial documents, if any part of the bill of lading is not exactly in the scope of the letter of credit, and that sale is approved, and the goods are loaded, and things are on water, and it's found to be out of scope, somebody's losing $10 million. And it falls apart. So letter of credit compliance is an incredibly complex thing. Nobody trusts one another. Nobody has any sort of clarity, and everybody has an incentive to begin to game the system for their own benefit. So to the maximum extent they have to be compliant with the letter of credit, they will, but there are always ways around it. And anybody like me who's ever exported millions of dollars worth of a feed ingredient to China will know they will come up with a really clever way to weasel out the contract, or at least try to get you to take a $100,000 discount on something you were not expecting. That transparency, that clarity, and that ability to clear an international shipment from a trade side is where Bitcoin steps in and solves the problem. We do things the way we do because for 500 years we had a gold-backed currency and a fiat currency, and we were trying to do business with each other in two different currencies that are completely subject to the whims of politicians or economics or whatever it may be. It's simple human nature. So if I now have the ability to buy or sell and clear a transaction, create a contract, pass commercial documents in a way that is not only simple and much more efficient, but I also have the ability to know it is impossible for the counterparty to game that for their benefit and screw me over. I've eliminated counterparty risk, which is 95% of the reason we do things the way we do on the international trade side. I've also eliminated my ability or my fear of investing into a relationship with someone on a domestic or international side. I've also eliminated my ability and my fear to not sell down to the local level. If I'm selling and distributing to a farmer, the first thing I'm concerned about with a farmer or a feed mill or whatever it may be is, do they have the ability to pay me? Am I going to spend all of this time, effort, and money overseas exporting an ingredient from India or wherever it may be, bring it to the United States, only to then lose my shirt on the deal because somebody was dishonest or somebody couldn't pay all the way at the back end of that transaction? It happens all the time. It is an enormous choke point in the trade process. It also happens to be the thing, the billion-dollar solution to a lot of companies' issues would be to use Bitcoin and blockchain to conduct these transactions. It is the only way available anywhere on Earth that is completely divorced from profit motive, completely divorced from political motive, completely divorced from the ability to game that in a meaningful way, and it introduces a level of confidence and clarity into the process that we've never had before, ever. So I can buy and sell in Bitcoin with someone overseas. I can buy and sell in my denominated currency. They can buy and sell in their denominated currency. You can clear the transaction in Bitcoin because it's indexed to both. In my own case, I'm working on building out smart contract technology for this exact reason. It is compliant with international trade norms, it is compliant with domestic and North American trade norms, but it's also completely divorced from the ability of any of those countries or from the ability of any of the existing mechanisms that manage counterparty risk today to take a bite out of me or take a bite out of that transaction and continue to force us into this very fragile economic system. When you begin to look at Bitcoin as a vector as opposed to a financial instrument, when you began to look at it as a way of reducing risk and modifying human behavior, you begin to see it in the way I see it, which is a mechanism for social change. which is a mechanism for allowing individuals to lead a little bit more resilient lives and do it in such a way that it's a little bit cheaper. I love Adam's example of utilizing stranded energy, I believe is the term, right? To to help facilitate the process of mining and transacting Bitcoin. And I like it because innovation, what is it? Necessity is the mother of invention, right? Innovation follows from that. And so there has not really ever been a distributed at-scale way to generate innovation of that sort. I was on Marty Bent's podcast a while back, and I think that was actually what got me the invite to do this. And I made a joke. I swear to you, I had no idea. I made a joke about when we should be capturing cow farts and building and utilizing them power production for mining. And he goes, "Oh, it's being done." And I'm like, great. Now we have an answer for the climate crisis because cows get blamed for half of the climate change issues, right? Cow farts are making the world warm or cold, depending on what story you believe. So there is a geopolitical angle to it, but in the process of solving one problem, you actually resolve 2, 3, 4, and 5 problems down the line. You make it easier to adopt this new currency. You make it easier to create parallel economies. You're solving what many claim is a very important issue, which is climate change. You're taking steps to do that. And I'm not aware of any technology in the world short of nuclear power that has so many benefits from one single course of action. We tend to specialize in the supply chain world, right? The old saying is that specialization is for insects, and that's largely true. But in the supply chain world, we tend to build things for one purpose and one purpose alone. We build a die, and it stamps this piece of metal. Or we make tires, but it's in this very specific size that can only be used by aircraft, or by a truck, or whatever it may be. Everything is specialized. And so now we're introducing something to the equation in Bitcoin and in blockchain technology that allows me to completely and wholesale, just by having the option to do it, completely change the way companies and countries and individuals are transacting business with one another. I don't care today that I can't go to Kroger and buy something in Bitcoin. It's not the standard. The dollar is still the standard in the United States, and it's going to be for quite some time. What I do care is that I can get to a point where I can look my vendor in the eye and say, go pound sand if you're not willing to do this as a smart contract. Go pound sand if you're not willing to sell this to me in a way where I can use Bitcoin as a clearing mechanism. The network is already there to do it. The architecture is already there to do it, to conduct these transactions and begin to clear those. My expectation is that this is going to become the way people do it simply because it works with human nature. It works with human nature to do it in this way, as opposed to have this very contentious, fear-laden system of trade that we have adopted. These documents that I have to go, if I want to do a letter of credit for something, and I tell them, hey, look, I need a letter of credit, and they say, great, how are we going to do it? I can't email those commercial documents I mentioned. I can't email them to someone and have them be considered valid, because someone could intercept that with a PDF editor and completely change it. You have multiple instances of documents floating around. Well, which one's the real one? How do we know? Right? 5 of these things say 5 different things. Which one's the real governing document? Blockchain does that. Up until blockchain, someone had to go print out 3 copies, hard copies on paper, sign them in blue or black ink, preferably blue so that when they're scanned I know they weren't gamed, go to a notary, get them stamped, witness my hand, all of that a notary has to do, and then they have to send them via courier from halfway around the world to me so that I know that those documents are authentic and genuine. Oh my God, what a stupid, terrible, awful, dumb way to do things. Because here's what happens, 50% of the time those documents get to me, they're wrong. Even if we pass them back and forth over email as drafts, like, yep, that's good, yep, that's good, yep, that's good. Inevitably, some human, the single point of failure in anything, changed it, printed it out, sent it to me, said, nope, it's good, it gets to me, it's not good. So I have to destroy those documents. I have to shred them. I have to use a crosscut shredder shredder, because if it's just a normal shredder, then those can be put back together. I don't know, but I have to cross-cut. So I have to go through some situation on my side, and then 2 weeks later, another set of commercial documents arrives to me. What an ignorant way to do things when we have something that's more available. Something that allows me in real time to verify the accuracy of the documents, to verify that these goods were packed and prepared and shipped and the documents prepared in a meaningfully correct way, that I can then know that when they land in the United States, I can take title of them according to the terms spelled out in the documents. Bitcoin doesn't begin to matter from a supply chain side until we can do that. Until we can do that. Because people like Joel are not able to buy the things they need on an international basis until I can do that at the top level on the international side or on the domestic side, and then sell that to him in a way that gives him the resources at the farm level to buy and sell in whatever currency he chooses, whether it's Bitcoin or a dollar or anything else. The easiest way to say it is that Bitcoin, for me, from a supply chain side, from an economic side, is a bit like an Iron Man suit. Right? I've used this example to people. And what I mean by that is this. People, ideas, and technology in that order, right? Technology does not exist, and Bitcoin is first and foremost a technology. All right? It's a technological innovation in the way humans conduct business with one another. It also happens to mirror the natural way humans do business with one another. But it is a technology. It will not solve world hunger. We will. It will not make it easier to donate to politicians in a way that prevents us from knowing that it was somebody kicking $1 billion into the system from overseas with an intent to gain the election. Right? Now there's no dispute if the Russians influence the election, because we can track every political donation. The technology allows people to do business more ethically and honestly and more transparently. Okay? Machines do not solve the problems. Automation does not solve the problems. AI does not solve the problems. If we think that all they're going to do is solve our problems for us. Technologies should turn people into superheroes. Make it so that I can do more with my day. I can do business cleaner. I can do business faster and more accurately and more profitably. I can buy and sell the things that I want to buy and sell. I can create generational wealth for my children by buying land. I can do all of the things that I want to do that matter to me and me alone, and I don't give a damn what anybody else says, because I'm allowed to do it my way as long as I don't hurt anybody else. And I don't care what anybody else does as long as they abide by the same rules. Bitcoin ultimately makes it possible for people and humans to have a world. And it's optimum. It's never going to be optimum, all right? But it does allow us to get a heck of a lot closer to good, right? It allows us, like the Iron Man suit, like it enabled Tony Stark to become a superhero. Without it, he's just Tony Stark. He's a brilliant dude. He's got a lot of resources. With it, he can go kick the Hulk's ass, right? It turns human beings. It's a force multiplier for people to have better lives. I believe in it for that reason. Okay. But my biggest encouragement to people is simply disengage with the magical thinking aspects of any technology, Bitcoin included, cars, whatever it may be. Nothing is going to solve everything, but it can get us close. And so if we can dispense with magical thinking and understand that there is a real, brutal, hard-nosed reality in front of us in order to be able to utilize this technology in the way in which we all hope and intend for it to be used, that's when political change follows, that's when the financial system follows, that's when all of the things that are upstream from individual decisions begin to follow. Is if you simply reframe it as a technology and an innovation that must be protected, that must be guarded, but above all, must be demanded at the supply chain level. That A to B, right? Everything moves. A to B. That dash in the middle, that logistics, that supply chain piece where humans meet their need, is where you have to meet the average person and explain the benefits of this to them and demand and say, hey, look, I need to be able to pay a mover. If I'm moving my house, I need to be able to pay that mover Bitcoin. Why can't I do that? You ask them. Enough people ask them, they begin to figure out how to do that, right? It begins with people like me at the top of the system, of the food chain, quite literally in my case, demanding to be able to buy and sell and transact goods across borders in a way that is both congruent to the last 500 years of human innovation and ways of doing business, but that also points us towards that better future. So to the extent that I have any sort of takeaway, it's this. This will never matter as a technology. This will never matter as a meaningful weapon of change and a meaningful pursuit of individual sovereignty unless the people who intend to use it that way actually demand to use it that way. Don't just sit around trading it. Don't just sit around talking about wallets and talking about mining and all these other things, but you have to actually go out and find every single way in which your world, your supply chain interacts with the world at large, and begin to find those opportunities and demand that this technology be used in a way that is, again, congruent, recognizable, but moves us towards those parallel economies. Because eventually, you have a economy and you have an underground economy. This grows up enough to a point where it becomes a parallel economy, and you bridge that gap by utilizing technologies like Bitcoin and blockchain. And because it works in alignment with human nature, and because it works in alignment with recognizable ways people have conducted business for thousands of years, eventually that parallel economy became underground economy, parallel economy becomes the economy. It's a grind, it's an arduous process, it's not a thing that can be lobbied for, it's Irish democracy. It's a whole bunch of people choosing in ways large and small over a long period of time to demand that implementation and adoption of the technology. So someday, very, very soon, I'm going to be able to buy beef from Joel in Bitcoin. Or I may not. I may not have Bitcoin, I may have dollars. But we can clear that transaction one way or the other. I'm going to be able to sell him his feed in whatever currency he chooses. And that's where, for me, the pragmatic reality, that brutal, it moves or it doesn't move reality of what I live in, and I live every day, meets the virtualization, the financialization, and the hopes and dreams of Bitcoin, right? I can't do what I do until this here all happens. But this here can't happen until I get to do what I do. So I hope and I encourage every one of you, I hope you learned something. I'm not going to plug myself, I don't really give a shit about being famous or anything like that. But what I do care is that like 20 years from now, we all come back together and we go, holy crap, we've come a long ways. Everything in my house I have because I was able to buy it or sell it in Bitcoin. And I hope to be able to look you all in the eye and say, hey look man, I'm moving thousands of tons of product a month, a real physical tangible thing, and a real physical piece of crap barge, probably paying a surly river pilot to guide it up the Mississippi River for me, but I'm able to do all of that in whatever currency I choose. I'm able to do that in a way that makes it cheaper and easier for you all. So I do thank you for your time. I hope this helped, and it wasn't just like some bald idiot rambling at you, and I'm very, very grateful for your attention. So thank you. Yes, any questions? I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. You're referring to Joel Salatin, the permaculture. Yes.
I'm referring to Joel behind you.
Joel behind me. Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. So I'm familiar with Joel Salatin.
Oh, he's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love Joel Salatin.
Well, and he was on the Joe Rogan podcast advocating for what you were talking about.
Absolutely.
About localizing the beef supply chain specifically, because that's what he was familiar with. And how do we get beef suppliers like Joel and the other Joel?
Yep.
How do we get these suppliers encouraged to participate in the Bitcoin? Obviously, through conversations, individual to individual. But as a supply chain guru, I mean, how would you encourage them to?
Half smart on my best day.
How would you encourage them to adopt that into their?
It actually starts with a piece of regulatory change.
Okay.
So Thomas Massey, I don't know if you guys know, he's a representative out of Kentucky. So Thomas Massey is a bit of a libertarian legend in a lot of ways, but one of the things that in a real meaningful policy standpoint he's pushed for is the Prime Act. And the Prime Act essentially makes it easier and more open environment for custom processing of animal protein to happen outside of the USDA regulatory environment. And that is a perfect and ripe opportunity for Bitcoin to emerge as an alternative currency and clearing mechanism and contracting mechanism for the custom processors, the producers, and the buyers.
And that's currently in debate right now.
And that's been pushed in the last 8 sessions of Congress. Maybe eventually he'll get it through. He's got like 48 co-sponsors right now.
Okay.
So that people being scared of their food supply chain has actually helped it.
So, with the able to mark across time and distance that a thing is actually stamped in time, how are you doing that? Are you doing like a hash of the contract, commercial contract to the time chain, where like you both know that it's like legitimate?
Someone figure that out for me, please.
I can tell you
I
how to do
what
it.
you just said.
It's doable now with the current tech
No, I'm
stack.
kidding. We do have a company that we've engaged that worked on, they were a subcontractor to, I don't know the name of the company, it was actually existing before I came in, thank God. But they were working with Maersk and IBM on, as a subcontractor to try to create smart logistics contracts.
Okay.
So I'll ask them how they do it and I'll let you know. Is that fair?
It's been happening with Open Timestamp with Peter Todd's project.
Right.
I mean, it's stupid easy. You can do a hash that's provable that's the exact same document, but it's
Stupid
done
easy is
right.
perfect for a stupid guy, thank you.
But yeah, you can literally be looking. I did this with some of my donations that I come across from foreign countries that wanted to support the beach movement, where we wrote up like a gentleman's agreement of what I'd use the money for, and then we hashed the document, and then we did a Bitcoin transaction where we posted that hash as a signature to the transaction. So we both provably know that we can look at the hash of the exact same text and always spit this hash out. So we know we have the same document, and we both do it, and then we compare it on a transaction. We both know we're hashing the same base text, but nobody else knows what the text says. It's like you can do that for pennies as far as over time and space having absolute confidence you're using the same document. Like it's already existing. You don't need any fancy contract or anything to do it.
Good.
Yeah.
Keeps it easy for me.
Yeah. Totally simple.
When we talk next week, like actually walk me through, if we gotta do a Zoom or Teams or something, but actually walk me
We
through.
just spent some time.
Yeah, we will.